Wax dripped onto the grand piano, pooling like hardened fat. Bella watched Alonso, her fiancé of exactly 3 hours, slide his thick hand down the spine of a woman who was decidedly not her. He didn't even bother to hide it behind a velvet curtain. Most prospective brides would weep or faint. Bella just felt the wire of her corset bite into her bruised ribcage and wondered if the carriages were still waiting outside. By midnight, she wouldn't be a duchess. She'd be a scandal. Bella Smith tasted metal. It was the cheap, acidic champagne the Duke of Westford had served to celebrate their betrothal, a vintage he had likely bought in bulk to save a few pennies while parading his vast, unearned wealth before the county. The ballroom was stifling. 200 bodies crammed into a space designed for half that number, all wrapped in heavy silk, stiff wool, and layers of desperation. The air smelled of wilting lilies, stale breath, and the sharp, sour tang of nervous sweat masked poorly by lavender water. She stood near a towering column of faux marble, her fingers tracing a chip in the plaster. It was a fake. The entire room was a fake, much like the ring sitting heavy and loose on her left hand. Across the room, Alonso Mendoza, the Duke of Westford, laughed. It was a wet braying sound that carried over the scraping of a cello in the corner. He leaned heavily against the mahogany bar, his face flushed a mottled crimson from brandy and heat. Tucked neatly under his arm, whispering directly into his ear, was Clara Hughes. Clara was a widow of minor consequence but major appetites, known entirely for the dangerous slope of her neckline and the way she smelled heavily of patchouli. Alonso's hand was not resting on Clara's waist. It was significantly lower, gripping the green taffeta of her gown with the careless entitlement of a man inspecting a horse he had already purchased. Bella didn't feel a shred of heartbreak. To have your heart broken, you had to actually use it. What she felt was a slow, sickening crawl of humiliation, hot and prickly, rising up the back of her neck. It wasn't that Alonso had a mistress. Every man of his station had a mistress, usually stowed away in a tidy townhouse in the city, kept out of sight through a mutual, unspoken pact of polite society. It was the laziness of it, the sheer, unadulterated disrespect. They had announced their engagement before supper. The ink on the marriage settlements, signing over Bella's ancestral farmlands to cover Alonso's staggering gambling debts in exchange for his title, was barely dry in the library. And yet, before the grandfather clock in the hall had even struck 11, he was openly fondling another woman in front of the very peers they had invited to witness their union. "He is a pig, my dear." The voice belonged to Lady Agatha, Bella's aunt, who materialized beside her smelling of gin and peppermint. Agatha didn't look at Bella. Her sharp avian eyes remained fixed on Alonso. "Pigs have the decency to wallow in the mud where they belong," Bella replied, her voice flat. She took a sip of the terrible champagne. It burned her throat. "Alonso expects the mud to be brought to the drawing room." "You must look away," Agatha murmured, her fan snapping open to shield her mouth. "People are watching you. If you cry, they will pity you. If you glare, they will call you a shrew before the banns are even read." "I am doing neither." Bella kept her face entirely blank. It took a monumental physical effort. Underneath the heavy layers of her silver gown, her stomach roiled. The corset stays, pulled tight by her maid 3 hours ago, dug relentlessly into her floating ribs. Every shallow breath was a negotiation with pain. She watched a footman walk past, his white gloves stained with dark smudges from carrying trays of half-eaten roasted quail. The mundane reality of the room anchored her. This was her life now, a lifetime of looking the other way, of enduring the wet, heavy weight of Alonso in her bed, of managing estates while he drank himself into a stupor and pawed at widows. Alonso caught her eye across the room. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull his hand away from Clara. Instead, he raised his glass a fraction of an inch in Bella's direction, a smug, heavy-lidded smirk pulling at his wet mouth. It was a challenge. "I own you," that look said. "I have your lands. I have your father's signature. What are you going to do about it?" Bella's hand trembled. A drop of champagne spilled over the rim of her crystal glass, landing on her gloved thumb. It felt ice cold against her skin. She wasn't a hero. She had agreed to this bargain because her family was destitute. The roof of their manor was rotting, and her father was a man who cried into his porridge when the creditors came knocking. She had sold herself with her eyes wide open. But looking at Alonzo's smug, sweating face, a violent, irrational wave of revulsion crashed over her. "I need some air," Bella said sharply, shoving the half-empty glass onto a passing tray, nearly toppling a tower of petit fours. "Bella, do not cause a scene," Agatha hissed, her fingers biting into Bella's forearm. "He is the Duke. It is done." "It is not midnight yet," Bella whispered. She pulled her arm free, ignoring the sharp scrape of Agatha's nails. She turned her back on the ballroom. She didn't run. Running was for victims. She walked with a stiff, measured stride, her heels clicking aggressively against the parquet floor. The heavy silver fabric of her gown dragged behind her, catching on the sticky floorboards where drinks had been spilled and carelessly trampled. She pushed past a cluster of gossiping dowagers, ignoring their sudden hush and the avid, hungry gleam in their eyes. Let them talk. They were vultures waiting for a corpse. She refused to play dead. The hallway outside the ballroom was jarringly cold. The sudden drop in temperature hit Bella like a physical blow, shocking the breath from her lungs. The air here didn't smell of perfume and roasting meat. It smelled of beeswax, damp wool, and centuries of undisturbed dust. The silence was ringing, broken only by the distant, muffled thump of the orchestra playing a terribly off-tempo waltz. Bella didn't know where she was going. She just needed a door that locked. She hurried down the dim corridor, the heavy sconces casting long, distorted shadows against the flocked wallpaper. She bypassed the drawing rooms, too likely to be occupied by couples seeking dark corners, and headed toward the Duke's private library. Alonzo hated reading. He claimed books gave him a sour stomach. It would be empty. She grabbed the heavy brass handle. It was cold and slightly greasy. Pushing the heavy oak door open, she slipped inside and leaned her entire weight against the wood, shutting it with a solid, echoing click. She closed her eyes and let out a long, ragged breath. The silence of the room wrapped around her. For a moment, it was just her, the smell of decaying leather bindings and the faint scent of pipe tobacco. If you're going to weep, do try to muffle it. I have a splitting headache, and the acoustics in here are terribly unforgiving. Bella's eyes snapped open. Sitting in a wingback chair by the unlit hearth, shrouded in the shadows of the room, was Desmond Hayes, Lord of Ashbourne, Alonzo's closest neighbor, his bitterest rival, and a man who had no business being in this house, let alone in this library. Desmond didn't rise. He remained slouched in the chair, a glass of amber liquid balanced precariously on his knee. He wasn't dressed for a ball. He wore a dark, severe riding coat that looked slightly damp, and his cravat was entirely undone, hanging loose around his neck. His boots were scuffed with fresh mud. He looked exactly like what society whispered he was, a ruined, dangerous man holding onto the ragged edges of his aristocracy by his fingernails. "Lord Ashbourne," Bella said, her voice shaking slightly, though she willed it to be steady. "I was under the impression you were explicitly banned from the grounds." "I am," Desmond said lazily. He took a sip of his drink. "Alonzo threatened to have his gamekeepers shoot me on sight if I crossed the property line. But it's raining. I was riding past, and the library window was unlatched. I'm a creature of opportunity, Miss Smith." He leaned forward, the faint moonlight from the tall windows catching the sharp planes of his face. He wasn't handsome in the soft, powdered way the men in the ballroom were. His features were too sharp, his nose slightly crooked from a poorly healed break, and his eyes were a pale, startling gray that felt entirely too observant. "Why aren't you out there?" Desmond asked, gesturing vaguely toward the door with his glass. "Basking in the glow of your newly acquired dukedom? I hear the champagne is essentially battery acid, but the title should sweeten the taste." Bella felt a flare of pure white-hot anger. "If you have come merely to insult me, Lord Ashbourne, you can climb back out the window you broke into." "I didn't break it. Alonso is just too cheap to hire decent maintenance." Desmond set his glass on a side table. It landed with a dull clink. He finally stood up. He was taller than Alonso, leaner, moving with a quiet, deliberate grace that made Bella instinctively take a step back against the door. He walked slowly toward her, stopping just outside of arm's reach. He looked at her, really looked at her. He took in the stiffness of her posture, the pale, pinched look of her face, and the way her fingers were curled into tight, bloodless fists at her sides. His gaze flicked to her left hand, lingering on the heavy emerald ring Alonso had shoved onto her finger. "You aren't crying," Desmond noted, his tone shifting. The mocking edge was gone, replaced by a quiet, calculating curiosity. "I don't cry." "No, I suppose you wouldn't." He tilted his head. "So, did he insult your father, or did he finally put his hands on that tragic widow from Bath in front of the bishop?" Bella flinched. The reaction was tiny, just a slight tightening of her jaw, but Desmond caught it. He let out a low, humorless laugh. "Ah, Clara Hughes. I should have guessed. Alonso never did possess an ounce of imagination or restraint." Desmond stepped closer, the smell of damp wool, rain, and sharp tobacco surrounding her. It was entirely unrefined and strangely grounding, and you realized suddenly and violently that a lifetime of turning a blind eye is a much longer sentence than it sounds. "My realizations are my own business," Bella snapped. Her ribs ached. The corset was suffocating her. "Step aside." "To let you do what?" Desmond asked softly. "Go back out there. Smile tightly while he parades his mistress in front of the county, cementing your position as the pathetic, compliant little wife before the ink is even dry on the registry." "I have no choice." The words tore out of her throat louder than she intended, raw and jagged. "My father is penniless. The estate is mortgaged to the rafters. Alonso holds the debt. If I walk away tonight, my family is ruined. We will be thrown into the street. So yes, I will go back out there and I will survive it, because the alternative is starvation." She was breathing heavily now, her chest heaving against the rigid whalebone. She hated herself for losing control. She hated Desmond for witnessing it. Desmond stared down at her, his pale eyes narrowing. He didn't offer her empty platitudes. He didn't tell her it would be all right. He just watched her, his mind working behind his sharp gaze. "Alonso holds your father's debts," Desmond repeated slowly, rolling the words around in his mouth. "The notes on the Smith estate." "Yes." "And if Alonso were publicly humiliated, if the marriage did not take place, he would call them in out of spite." "Immediately." Bella swallowed hard, the metallic taste of the champagne returning to her mouth. "Which is why I am going to open this door, walk back down that hallway, and endure my evening. Keep—" Desmond stepped back, shoving his hands deep into the pockets of his damp coat. He looked toward the unlit fireplace, his jaw working. "What if he couldn't call them in?" Desmond asked quietly. Bella frowned. "I don't understand." Desmond turned back to her. The lazy, cynical aristocrat was gone. In his place was a man who looked distinctly like a wolf staring at an open gate. "Alonso's debts are tangled. He owes a fortune to the crown in back taxes. He planned to use your dowry lands to offset his own ruin." Desmond stepped closer again. "I know this because I bought the promissory notes Alonso used to secure those taxes." Bella's breath hitched. "You... what?" "I have been buying up Alonso's secondary debts for 3 years," Desmond said, his voice a low hum. "I hold the paper on his London townhouse, his racing stable, and as of last week, the lien against his primary estate. I was waiting for the right moment to gut him." Bella stared at him, her mind spinning wildly. The rivalry between Ashbourne and Westford was legendary, a feud spanning 2 generations over a disputed river boundary. But this was not a feud. This was a systematic financial slaughter. "Why are you telling me this?" Bella whispered. Desmond looked down at her bare shoulders, at the heavy insulting emerald on her hand, and finally into her eyes. "Because, Miss Smith," Desmond said softly, "if you walk out of this room as Alonso's fiancée, you belong to him. But if you walk out of this room as my wife, Alonso's claims against your father become legally subordinate to my claims against Alonso." The silence in the library was absolute. Bella could hear the blood rushing in her ears. "What are you saying?" she breathed. Desmond pulled a folded piece of heavy parchment from the inner breast pocket of his coat. He tapped it against his knuckles. "I procured a special license from the Archbishop 3 days ago. I had intended to travel to London tomorrow to secure an heiress. I need cash to finally bankrupt our mutual friend in the ballroom." He tossed the parchment onto the desk beside him. "But I think ruining Alonso's pride, stealing his bride in the middle of his own betrothal ball, and legally blocking him from touching your family's land might be infinitely more satisfying." Bella stared at the folded parchment on the desk, as if it were a coiled snake. "You are insane," she said. Her voice lacked conviction. It sounded entirely too breathy. "I am pragmatic," Desmond countered. He leaned against the desk, crossing his arms over his chest. "Alonso took a strip of land from my father 20 years ago. It broke the old man's heart. I intend to take everything Alonso has, his money, his land, and tonight, his dignity. You despise him. I despise him. We have a mutual enemy and mutually beneficial assets. It is a much cleaner transaction than the one you made 3 hours ago." "It's madness." Bella pressed a hand to her temple. The corset was digging into her hips now. The sheer absurdity of the situation made her dizzy. "We are practically strangers. You are a notorious rogue. You have a terrible reputation." "I have an accurate reputation," Desmond corrected smoothly. "I am ruthless, I am vindictive, and I am currently entirely sober. Alonso is a drunk who is currently suffocating a widow in the next room. Which of us do you trust to keep a contract?" Bella looked at him. The dim light cast harsh shadows under his cheekbones. He wasn't looking at her with lust. There was no romance in his eyes, no heroic devotion. He was looking at her like a business partner, like a weapon he could wield against a man he hated. It was the most honest proposition she had received in her entire life. "My father's debts," Bella said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You swear you would nullify them?" "I will assume them, and then I will bury Alonso in so much litigation he won't be able to afford the stamps to mail a demand letter," Desmond said. He didn't blink. "Your father's estate will remain entirely untouched. You have my word as a gentleman." He paused, a cynical smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Or at least as a man who hates Alonso Mendoza more than he loves money." Bella looked back toward the heavy oak door. Beyond it lay the stifling heat of the ballroom, the sour champagne, Lady Agatha's sharp fingernails, Alonso's wet, heavy hands, a lifetime of quiet, suffocating humiliation. She looked back at Desmond. The cold draft from the broken window ruffled the edge of his undone cravat. He was offering her a cliff to jump off. It would be a scandal of epic proportions. Her name would be ruined in polite society. She would be pariah, but she would be free of Alonso. "There is a chapel," Bella said, her voice suddenly entirely steady. It surprised her. "St. Jude's. It is 2 miles down the south road. The vicar there, Reverend Thomas, owes my family a favor. He was my mother's cousin." Desmond's pale eyes flared with a sudden sharp light. He uncrossed his arms. "Can he be bought to perform a midnight ceremony with no bands, relying solely on a special license?" "He drinks heavily and his roof leaks," Bella said coldly. "He will do it for 20 pounds. Desmond let out a sharp bark of laughter. It was a genuine sound, startling in the quiet room. "Miss Smith, I have severely underestimated you." "Do not flatter me, Lord Ashbourne. This is entirely mercenary." Bella walked over to the desk. She grabbed the special license. The paper was thick, smelling faintly of the Archbishop's wax seal and Desmond's tobacco. If we do this, we do it now. The clock in the hall chimes midnight in less than an hour. Once the clock strikes, the formal announcements are made, and my father publicly hands over the deeds. It will be too late. Then we don't wait. Desmond pushed off the desk. My horse is tied near the western terrace. I didn't bring a carriage. Bella looked down at her massive, unwieldy silver gown. It weighed at least 20 pounds. The skirts were heavily embroidered with pearls. I cannot ride in this. Desmond walked toward her. He stopped inches away, pulling a small, wicked-looking silver folding knife from his waistcoat pocket. He flipped it open with his thumb. The blade gleamed dull in the moonlight. "Turn around," he ordered quietly. Bella hesitated for only a fraction of a second. She turned her back to him. She felt his hands on her waist. They were large, the skin calloused, a sharp contrast to Alonso's soft, unworked palms. Desmond didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy, restrictive silver silk of her overskirt, pulled it taut, and slid the blade through the fabric. The sound of tearing silk was loud and vicious in the quiet library. Bella gasped as the weight of the gown suddenly vanished, pooling in a heavy, ruined pile of silver and pearls at her feet. She was left standing in her white muslin underdress and her tightly laced corset. The cool air of the library hit her bare arms and legs. She felt incredibly exposed, but the suffocating weight was gone. She could breathe. For the first time all evening, she could take a full, deep breath. Desmond stepped back, folding the knife with a sharp click. He didn't look at her body. His eyes remained fixed on her face. He reached up, unclasped his heavy dark wool riding coat, and held it out to her. "Put this on," he said. "It's raining." Bella slid her arms into the coat. It was massive on her, dropping past her knees. It was still warm from his body, and the smell of rain and tobacco enveloped her completely. It felt like armor. She looked down at her left hand. The heavy emerald ring Alonso had given her felt like a shackle. She grabbed the stone, twisting it violently over her knuckle until it scraped the skin, and pulled it free. It left a raw, red mark on her finger. She placed the ring exactly in the center of Alonso's pristine mahogany desk. "Shall we?" Desmond asked. He offered her his arm. Bella looked at him. The cynical rogue, the disgraced lord, her new husband. She didn't take his arm. Instead, she walked past him toward the window he had climbed through. "Try to keep up, Ashbourne," she said, pulling the heavy wool coat tight across her chest. "We are on a schedule." Desmond grinned in the dark, a flash of white teeth. "Lead the way, my dear." They slipped out the window into the freezing, driving rain, leaving the ruined silver gown and the discarded emerald ring sitting in the dark, silent library, waiting for the clock to strike midnight. The rain did not fall so much as it attacked. It drove sideways in freezing, stinging sheets, instantly soaking the thin muslin of Bella's underdress where Desmond's coat did not cover her. The mud of the terrace swallowed her silk slippers whole. With her second step, the left shoe tore entirely off her foot, remaining lodged in the muck with a wet, sucking sound. She did not stop to retrieve it. She walked with one bare foot and one ruined slipper, the sharp gravel of the carriage path biting into her heel. "Here," Desmond said, his voice barely carrying over the wind. He had tied his horse to a rusted iron ring on the stone balustrade. The animal was a massive, ill-tempered roan gelding that shifted anxiously in the storm, its hooves scraping against the paving stones. It smelled strongly of wet hide, damp hay, and nervous sweat. Desmond stepped into her personal space, the sheer size of him blocking the worst of the wind. "You cannot ride side saddle in this weather. The mud is too slick. You will have to hike up the coat and straddle him." A polite young lady would have gasped. Bella just hiked the heavy wool up to her mid-thigh, exposing her bare, goosebump-covered legs to the biting rain. Modesty was a luxury for women who weren't fleeing their own betrothal balls in the dead of night. Desmond gripped her by the waist. His hands were hard, his fingers digging slightly into the stiff whalebone of her corset beneath the wet muslin. He hoisted her up with a single fluid motion. The leather saddle was freezing. The friction of the horse's coarse coat scratched against her bare calves. Desmond didn't bother checking the stirrups. He swung up behind her, crowding her forward against the pommel. "Hold on to the mane," he ordered, his mouth near her ear. "Do not let go." He spurred the gelding. The horse surged forward, tearing up clumps of manicured lawn as they bypassed the main gates and plunged into the dense line of oak trees bordering the estate. The ride was a blur of absolute jarring misery. Every stride of the massive horse rattled Bella's teeth. Her corset stays dug viciously into her waist, restricting her lungs so that she had to pant in shallow, frantic bursts. The rain plastered her hair to her cheeks, blinding her. It ran down her neck, a freezing trickle that settled between her shoulder blades. Behind her, Desmond was a solid, unyielding wall of heat. He rode with a reckless, punishing speed, ducking low branches by instinct alone. He didn't try to hold her against him, but the violent motion of the horse forced her back into his chest. She could feel the steady, heavy thud of his heart against her spine. It wasn't comforting. It was terrifyingly real. She was riding into the pitch-black night with a man who had made a career out of ruin. Doubt, sharp and sour, finally managed to pierce through the adrenaline. "What have I done?" The thought echoed in time with the striking hooves. Alonso was a known evil, a lazy, drunken, wandering evil. But this? Desmond Hayes was a sheer drop into a jagged canyon. He had bought her father's debts to use as a weapon. He was marrying her purely to spite another man. There was no affection here, only cold, hard arithmetic. She tasted mud and rain on her lips. A low branch whipped past, a wet leaf slapping against her frozen cheek. But then she remembered the heavy, suffocating scent of patchouli in the ballroom. She remembered Alonso's wet, braying laugh, and the careless way his hand had gripped Clara Hughes's dress. She remembered the sheer, overwhelming dread of walking down an aisle toward a man who looked at her entirely as a transaction he was already bored with. Desmond, at least, respected her enough to treat her like an accomplice. "Turn here!" she yelled over her shoulder, her voice cracking. "The dirt path by the old mill." Desmond didn't answer, but the horse banked sharply to the right. The animal's hooves slipped terrifyingly in the deep mud, scrambling for purchase before finding solid dirt. They broke through the tree line, and the crumbling stone spire of St. Jude's Chapel appeared against the bruised, storm-swept sky. Desmond hauled back on the reins. The gelding slid to a halt, its sides heaving, steam rising off its wet coat in thick, gray clouds. Before the horse had even fully stopped, Desmond swung down, his boots splashing heavily into a puddle. He reached up and pulled Bella down. Her legs were entirely numb. The moment her bare foot hit the freezing ground, her knee buckled. Desmond caught her. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't linger. He simply shoved a heavy, wet arm around her waist, and half carried, half dragged her toward the heavy wooden doors of the chapel. The inside of St. Jude's was pitch black and smelled deeply of mildew, old hymnals, and mice. Rain drummed relentlessly against the slate roof, a deafening, chaotic applause. "Stay here," Desmond muttered. He released her, his footsteps echoing hollowly as he walked deeper into the nave. Bella leaned against the stone wall of the vestibule. She was shivering so violently her teeth clicked together in a rapid, uncontrollable rhythm. She pulled Desmond's coat tighter around herself, but the wool was soaked through, heavy and smelling of wet sheep. She reached up with a numb hand and peeled a wet lock of hair from her eye. A faint yellow glow bloomed near the altar. Desmond walked back down the aisle carrying a single cheap tallow candle. The light cast harsh, shifting shadows across the hollows of his cheeks. Behind him, shuffling and muttering, came Reverend Thomas. The vicar was a small, stooped man wrapped in a faded wool dressing gown. He smelled strongly of stale ale and sleep. He held his spectacles tightly against his face, squinting through the gloom at Bella. "B?" "Little Bella," he croaked, his voice thick with phlegm. "What in God's name are you doing here? Your father sent a note yesterday. You are to marry the Westford boy tonight." "Plans have changed, Reverend," Desmond said smoothly, cutting off whatever lie Bella might have tried to form. He reached into his damp coat and pulled out the special license. The paper was slightly warped from the damp, but the Archbishop's seal remained unbroken. He handed it to the vicar, along with the heavy leather coin purse that clinked loudly in the quiet church. £20. Gold. For a service immediately. The vicar weighed the purse in his palm. His eyes darted between the thick, heavy gold in his hand, the ruin of Bella's appearance, and the dangerous, quiet stillness of the man standing beside her. "No banns?" the vicar asked weakly. "No witnesses?" "The license supersedes the banns," Desmond said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "And God is witnessing. That should suffice for your paperwork." The vicar swallowed hard. He looked at Bella, seeking an escape or a plea for help. "Please, cousin," Bella said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any pleading. "Do it quickly, before I catch my death in this draft." The old man nodded slowly. He didn't bother to change into his vestments. He merely walked to the altar, setting the tallow candle on the edge of the carved stone. He opened a cracked leather registry book, his hands trembling slightly as he uncorked a bottle of ink. Desmond turned to Bella. He held out his hand. She looked at it. It was a large hand, the knuckles pale, the skin smeared with a streak of dark mud from the horse's reins. She raised her own hand. It was shaking violently, her fingers blue with cold. When she placed her hand in his grip was instantly crushing. He didn't hold her hand like a lover. He held it like an anchor. The heat from his skin was a stark shock against her freezing fingers. They stood before the altar. There was no music. There was no congregation. There was only the smell of burning animal fat from the cheap candle, the sound of the rain, and the old man's raspy voice rushing through the ancient liturgy. Bella barely heard the words. The physical discomfort was overwhelming. Her bare foot ached with a dull, throbbing intensity. A drop of icy water fell from her wet hair, trailing slowly down her collarbone and slipping beneath the tight edge of her corset. "Do you, Desmond Julian Hayes, take this woman?" Desmond didn't hesitate. "I do." His voice was a harsh, low scrape against the stone walls. "And do you, Bella Eleanor Smith?" She stared at the flickering candle flame. Alonzo would be noticing she was gone by now. He would be irritated, sending footmen to check the powder rooms. He wouldn't be worried. He would be annoyed that his property had wandered off. "I do," Bella said. Her voice didn't shake. "The ring?" the vicar prompted nervously. Desmond paused. He hadn't thought of a ring. He reached into his coat, his jaw tightening, clearly intending to pry off his own signet ring. "We don't need one," Bella interrupted sharply. "Just finish it." The vicar blinked, clearly scandalized, but the heavy purse sitting on the altar shut his mouth. "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife." The silence that followed was suffocating. They didn't kiss. They didn't even look at each other. "Sign the book," Desmond ordered, dropping her hand immediately. He stepped toward the registry, picking up the quill. The scratch of the metal nib against the thick parchment was excruciatingly loud. He signed his name with vicious, slashing strokes. He handed her the quill. The wood was warm from his fingers. Bella looked down at the registry. The ink was wet and gleaming. Desmond Hayes. She pressed the nib to the paper. Her hand shook so badly that a drop of black ink splattered across the white page, looking entirely like a bruised mark. She gripped her own wrist with her left hand, forcing her fingers to steady. She wrote Bella Hayes. It was done. She had traded a slow death by suffocation for a sudden, violent jump into the dark. "Come," Desmond said. He didn't wait for her. He turned on his heel and walked back down the aisle, his boots striking the stone with heavy final thuds. Bella dropped the quill. It rolled off the registry and stained the altar cloth. She turned and followed her husband back out into the freezing rain. Midnight was fast approaching, and the explosion was about to begin. Water poured from the chapel eaves in a heavy freezing sheet. Bella dragged her remaining slipper through the muck, her foot completely numb, the cold biting deep into her bones. Desmond did not offer meaningless comforts or gentle touches. He gripped her waist, hoisting her back onto the freezing leather saddle with a blunt efficiency. His soaked wool coat dragged heavily against her bare, shivering legs. He swung up behind her. The horse grunted, shifting its massive bulk in the slick mud. "Hold tight," Desmond ordered, the rumble of his chest vibrating against her spine. "Where to?" Bella gasped, sputtering as a gust of wind drove rain directly into her mouth. She expected him to say Ashbourne. She expected a dark, crumbling manor and a miserable fire. "Back to Westford," Desmond said. He spurred the gelding, leaning hard into the turn. "Alonso's little party requires its guests of honor." Panic, hot and entirely blinding, flared in her chest. "Are you mad? We cannot go back there, not like this. We must go back exactly like this." Desmond's voice cut through the howling wind, sharp and unforgiving. "If we hide, Alonso dictates the narrative. He will claim you were kidnapped. He will play the victim, and tomorrow morning he will foreclose on your father out of spite. We are going to walk through his front doors in front of the entire county, and we are going to cut his legs out from under him." Bella squeezed her eyes shut. Her stomach pitched violently with every heavy stride of the horse. She was terrified. She was a woman who had spent 22 years carefully folding her hands in her lap, speaking in measured tones, and making herself as small and agreeable as possible. She was not built for public spectacles. She was not built for war. But as the freezing rain lashed her face, another feeling began to crawl up her throat, pushing past the terror. It tasted sharp and clean. It was anger. A lifetime of being bartered, evaluated, and quietly dismissed settled heavily in her chest. Alonso had looked at her like a broodmare. He had humiliated her purely because he knew he could. She gripped the horse's coarse mane, her knuckles turning white. She wanted to see Alonso's face when he realized he owned nothing. She wanted to watch his smug, flushed features collapse. The ride back was a blur of aggressive speed. Desmond pushed the horse relentlessly, the animal's hooves tearing up the manicured carriage path as they broke through the Westford gates. The massive manor house loomed ahead, a beacon of yellow light cutting through the storm. Carriages were still lined up along the gravel drive, their drivers huddled under heavy tarps, smoking pipes that smelled faintly of cherry wood. Desmond bypassed the stables and rode directly toward the grand front entrance. He didn't slow down. He hauled back on the reins right at the base of the marble steps. The gelding reared slightly, its iron shoes sparking and scraping violently against the stone. Two footmen stationed at the double doors jumped back in absolute shock, their powdered wigs slipping askew. Desmond dropped to the ground. His boots hit the marble with a wet, heavy thud. He reached up and pulled Bella down. Her legs gave out completely. She collapsed against his chest, the wet wool of his coat rough against her cheek. He caught her, wrapping an arm securely around her waist to keep her upright. "Can you walk?" he asked quietly, his mouth near her ear. "I have one shoe," she answered, her voice trembling. "Then limp proudly, Mrs. Hayes." He didn't carry her. Carrying her would have looked like a rescue. He let her stand on her own, keeping his hand firmly on the small of her back to steady her. They walked up the stairs. The footmen, mouths agape, scrambled to pull the heavy oak doors open. The sudden rush of hot air from the foyer hit Bella like a physical blow. The sudden silence was even more jarring. The foyer was crowded with guests spilling out from the ballroom. Women in vibrant silks and men in tailored evening coats turned to look at the commotion. The smell of roasted meats, heavy perfumes, and sweat immediately replaced the sharp scent of the storm. Bella knew exactly what she looked like. She was drenched. Her hair hung in long, dripping rat tails around her pale face. She wore no gown, only a soaked muslin underdress hidden beneath an oversized, ruined riding coat. Her left foot was bare, smeared with dark mud that stained the pristine marble floor with every step. Beside her, Desmond looked like a pirate who had come to sack the manor. His coat was black with rain, his cravat gone, his pale eyes locked dead ahead. A low, collective murmur rippled through the crowd, sounding like a swarm of angry bees. Fans snapped open. Lords stepped back, pulling their wives with them. "Where is he?" Desmond demanded softly. Bella didn't have to answer. A heavy mechanical grinding sound echoed from the top of the grand staircase. The massive grandfather clock began its internal whir, preparing to strike. Midnight. At the bottom of the stairs stood Alonso. He was holding a crystal tumbler of brandy. His face was a mottled, unhealthy red, and his cravat was stained with a drop of brown gravy. He looked furious. Behind him stood Bella's father, Lord Smith, clutching a leather folio of deeds to his chest like a shield. Alonso's bleary eyes finally locked onto Bella. He didn't notice Desmond at first. He only saw his missing bride, ruined and dripping on his expensive floor. "Where the hell have you been?" Alonso barked, his voice echoing loudly in the sudden total silence of the foyer. "You missed the supper toast. You look like a drowned rat. Get upstairs and change. The announcements are to be made now." He waved his hand dismissively, turning back to Lord Smith. "Have the pens ready, Thomas. Let's get this farce over with." Bella didn't move. She stood perfectly still, a puddle of muddy rainwater pooling around her bare foot. "She will not be changing," Desmond said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a sharp, resonant authority that cut through the room like a blade. "And she will not be going upstairs." Alonso stopped. He turned slowly, his eyes finally shifting from Bella to the tall, imposing figure beside her. Recognition dawned on his face, followed instantly by a purple flush of sheer, unadulterated rage. "Ashbourne," Alonso snarled, his grip tightening on his glass. "What are you doing in my house? You're trespassing. I will have you shot." He looked at Bella, his upper lip curling in disgust. "And why is my fiancée wearing your coat?" "She is wearing my coat," Desmond said lazily, stepping slightly in front of Bella, "because it is cold outside, and she is not your fiancée." The first heavy chime of the grandfather clock rang out. Bong. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Lady Agatha, standing near a potted fern, actually dropped her glass of gin. It shattered on the marble, but no one moved to clean it up. "Have you lost your mind?" Alonso took a step forward, his chest puffing out. He pointed a thick, trembling finger at Bella. "She signed the betrothal contract. Her father signed over the lands. She is mine." "Contracts are only binding if they are the primary legal claim," Desmond countered smoothly. He reached into his damp inner pocket and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. It was no longer the special license. It was a dense, heavily stamped legal document. Bong. The second chime reverberated through the floorboards. Desmond walked forward, completely ignoring the footman who hovered nervously near Alonso. He stopped 3 feet from the furious Duke. "Let us discuss debts, Alonso," Desmond said, his voice dropping to a conversational murmur that forced everyone in the room to lean in to hear. "You owe the crown £40,000. You secured that debt with promissory notes backed by your racing stables and this very manor." Alonso's face paled beneath the flush. "That is private business." "It was," Desmond corrected, "until I bought those notes from your creditors in London last Tuesday." Bong. The third chime. Alonso's jaw went slack. His eyes darted nervously to the crowd, suddenly acutely aware of the 200 peers hanging on every word. You don't have that kind of capital. You are ruined." "I am remarkably frugal," Desmond smiled. It was a terrifying expression. "I now hold the primary lien on everything you own, the walls around you, the glass in your hand, the very boots on your feet." Alonso swallowed hard, the sound audible in the quiet room. He rallied, squaring his shoulders. It doesn't matter. The Smith lands are mine as of midnight. Their dowry will clear the crown's debt. I will pay you off tomorrow. He shot a venomous glare at Bella's father. Thomas, give me the deeds, now. Lord Smith trembled, taking a step forward, his eyes darting frantically between Alonso and his daughter. Bella, please, he whimpered. Stay exactly where you are, father, Bella said. Her voice shocked even herself. It wasn't the quiet, placating tone she had used her entire life. It was a harsh, raspy command, entirely void of sympathy. She stepped out from behind Desmond's shadow. She limped forward, the ruined hem of the coat dragging through the mud, and stopped beside her husband. Bong, the fourth chime. Alonso glared at her. Get over here, Bella. Stop this foolishness. I cannot, Your Grace, she said softly. She reached into the deep pocket of Desmond's coat and pulled out a second, slightly damp piece of paper. She didn't hand it to Alonso. She held it up, turning it so the surrounding guests could see the fresh ink and the Archbishop's unbroken seal. What is that? Alonso demanded, his voice pitching higher. It is a marriage registry, Bella stated clearly. Signed and witnessed not 20 minutes ago at St. Jude's Chapel. The room erupted. Whispers exploded into chaotic shouts. Dowagers clutched their pearls. Men cursed loudly. Bong. The fifth chime. Alonso stared at the paper. His brain seemed unable to process the words. A marriage. To whom? Desmond reached out and casually rested his large, muddy hand on the small of Bella's back. It was a distinctly territorial gesture. To me, Desmond said. Alonso dropped his glass. The heavy crystal hit the marble floor and exploded into 100 glittering shards, spraying amber brandy over the hem of his pristine trousers. No, Alonso breathed, stumbling backward a step. No, that is illegal. The betrothal... A betrothal is a promise, Desmond interrupted, his voice hardening into absolute steel. A marriage is a fact. Under the law, Bella's assets and the debts her family holds are now legally tied to her husband, which is me. Bong. The sixth chime. Desmond stepped closer to Alonso, dropping the conversational tone entirely. He leaned in, his pale eyes locked onto Alonso's terrified face. Which means, Alonso, your claim to the Smithlands is subordinate to my marriage rights. You cannot touch her estate. You cannot use her dowry to pay me. You have exactly 30 days to produce 40,000 pounds, or I will take this manor, I will evict you into the street, and I will burn your stables to the ground for the insurance money. Alonso was shaking. The arrogant, leering duke from the ballroom was entirely gone, replaced by a soft, panicked man realizing the floor had just vanished beneath him. He looked wildly at the crowd, seeking an ally, but the guests were already physically backing away. In high society, poverty was infinitely more contagious than the plague. No one wanted to stand near a ruined man. Bong. The seventh chime. Alonso looked at Bella. His eyes were wide, wet, and pleading. Bella, you cannot do this. I am a duke. You are a pig, Bella said. The words tasted like cold water on a hot day. And I am allergic to the mud. She turned away from him. She didn't look at her father, who was weeping quietly against the banister. She didn't look at Lady Agatha, whose jaw was resting on her chest. She simply looked at Desmond. I'm tired, Bella said quietly. The adrenaline was leaving her, replaced by a bone-deep ache. Desmond's eyes softened just a fraction. The wolfish grin disappeared, leaving something far more solid in its place. My carriage is waiting outside, he said. I had it brought around while you were changing out of your shoes. He offered her his arm. Bong. The eighth chime. Bella slid her hand through his. His arm was rock solid beneath the wet wool. They walked together, turning their backs on the frozen, gaping crowd, their footsteps echoing perfectly in time over the shattered crystal on the floor. Bong, the 9th chime. As they reached the heavy oak doors, Clara Hughes, the widow in the green taffeta, suddenly pushed her way through the front of the crowd. She looked frantically from Alonzo's pale, sweating face to the disappearing figures at the door. Without a word, Clara hitched up her heavy green skirts, turned, and practically sprinted toward the cloakroom to find her coat. Bong, the 10th chime. The footman pulled the doors open. The storm outside was finally breaking, the heavy rain slowing to a quiet, steady mist. Bong, the 11th chime. Desmond helped Bella into the waiting, unmarked black carriage. The interior smelled of old leather and damp, but there was a thick, dry wool blanket resting on the velvet seat. Desmond climbed in after her, pulling the heavy door shut and entirely sealing out the noise of Westford Manor. Bong, the 12th chime. Midnight had struck. Bella Hayes pulled the dry blanket over her wet shoulders, leaned her head against the rattling window pane, and finally took a full, deep breath. Rainwater seeped through the heavy velvet squabs of the carriage, smelling of wet earth and old horsehair. Bella sat huddled in the corner, the thick wool blanket pulled tightly up to her chin. The adrenaline that had carried her through the front doors of Westford Manor had entirely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in her bones. Her left foot throbbed where the gravel had cut her heel. Her ribs felt bruised, compressed so tightly by the wet corset that every breath was a shallow, painful gasp. Across the dark carriage, Desmond sat with his long legs stretched out, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't speak. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He simply watched the shadows of the passing trees flicker across her pale face. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was heavy with the sheer, crushing weight of reality. "You're shaking," Desmond noted, his voice a low rumble over the clatter of the iron-rimmed wheels. "I'm freezing," Bella corrected, her teeth clicking together. "And I believe my corset laces have seized in the damp. I cannot take a full breath." Desmond leaned forward. The carriage hit a rut in the road, swaying violently, but he moved with the easy balance of a man used to uneven ground. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small silver folding knife he had used to ruin her wedding gown. The blade snapped open with a sharp click. "Turn," he instructed. Bella didn't argue. She shifted on the velvet seat, turning her back to him and dropping the heavy blanket from her shoulders. The wet muslin underdress clung to her skin like a second layer of ice. Desmond's hands were warm against her freezing back. He didn't fumble. He found the top of the knotted, waterlogged laces and slid the blade smoothly downward. The thick cord snapped with a series of sharp pops. As the rigid whalebone structure gave way, Bella gasped, her lungs expanding fully for the first time in 8 hours. The sudden rush of oxygen made her dizzy. She slumped forward slightly, catching herself on the edge of the leather window frame. Desmond pulled the severed corset away, tossing it onto the opposite seat where it landed with a heavy, wet thud. He didn't touch her bare shoulders. He simply picked up the wool blanket and draped it back over her, tucking the edges firmly around her arms. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice rough. "Don't thank me yet," Desmond replied, leaning back into his corner. "You haven't seen Ashbourne in the daylight. Alonso's estate is a monument to excessive spending. Mine is a monument to excessive neglect." He wasn't exaggerating. 30 minutes later, the carriage turned through a set of rusted iron gates that shrieked loudly on their hinges. The driveway was unpaved, deeply rutted, and lined with ancient, overgrown oak trees whose branches scraped against the carriage roof like grasping fingernails. The manor house itself was a sprawling, severe structure of dark gray stone. There were no brightly lit windows, no footmen waiting on the steps. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress that had withstood a siege and barely survived. Desmond kicked the carriage door open before the driver even fully stopped the horses. He stepped out into the muddy courtyard and turned, offering Bella his hand. She took it. She stepped down, her bare foot sinking instantly into the cold mud. She didn't flinch. Mud was preferable to the pristine marble of Alonso's foyer. The heavy front door was pulled open from the inside by an elderly woman holding a single smoking oil lamp. She wore a thick woolen shawl over a faded nightgown, her gray hair braided tightly down her back. "Lord Ashburn," the woman said, her voice cracking with sleep and surprise. "We weren't expecting you back from the ball so soon, and you're soaked to the bone." She raised the lamp, her squinting eyes landing on Bella. The woman's mouth fell open. "Mrs. Gable," Desmond said smoothly, stepping into the dark, drafty hall and pulling Bella inside with him. "This is Bella. She's my wife. She requires a hot bath, a strong cup of tea, and whatever dry clothing you can find in the West Wing trunks." Mrs. Gable blinked. She looked at Desmond, then at the ruined, barefoot woman dripping onto the floorboards, and then at the massive, absent emerald on Bella's left hand. "Your wife," Mrs. Gable repeated flatly. "As of an hour ago. We are in a hurry, Mrs. Gable." The housekeeper didn't ask questions. She simply nodded, her expression shifting from shock to immediate practical concern. "Right then. The plumbing boiler is cold, but I can heat kettles on the kitchen hearth. Come along, my lady. Let's get you out of those wet things before you catch your death." Bella looked at Desmond. He was already shrugging out of his ruined riding coat, his mind clearly moving on to the next problem. "Go," he told her, catching her eye. "Sleep. Tomorrow will be loud." Morning arrived not with a warm glow, but with a flat, gray light that filtered weakly through the dusty velvet curtains of the guest bedroom. Bella woke to the smell of wood smoke and old lavender. She lay entirely still for a long moment, staring at the cracked plaster ceiling. The events of the previous night hit her not in a rush, but in slow, heavy blocks. The ball, the library, the freezing ride, the chapel, the shattering crystal in Alonzo's foyer. She sat up. Her body ached profoundly. Her ribs were tender to the touch, a physical memory of the corset, and her left heel was bandaged tightly where Mrs. Gable had cleaned the gravel cuts. Resting over the back of a wooden chair by the dying fire was a dress. It was deep navy blue wool, decades out of fashion, smelling faintly of mothballs and dried rose petals. It belonged to Desmond's late mother. Bella dressed slowly. The wool was heavy and warm, a stark contrast to the flimsy, restrictive silk she had worn the night before. There was no maid to lace her up, no corsets to squeeze her organs into an acceptable shape. She simply buttoned the front of the gown, tied her tangled hair back with a scrap of ribbon, and walked out into the hall. Ashbourne was quiet. The silence here wasn't the suffocating, expectant hush of Westford. It was the quiet of a house that had been empty for too long. The floorboards creaked under her borrowed leather slippers. She found Desmond in the library. It was a starkly different room from Alonzo's. There were no faux marble columns or pristine, unread leather volumes. The walls were lined with sagging bookshelves packed entirely full of books with broken spines and dog-eared pages. The desk in the center of the room was buried under stacks of ledgers, rolled maps, and legal documents. Desmond sat behind the desk. He hadn't slept. He wore a clean white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, but his jaw was dark with morning stubble, and the shadows under his pale eyes were bruised and heavy. He was holding a cup of black coffee, staring intently at a densely written contract. He looked up as she entered. He didn't offer a polite, empty smile. He just evaluated her, taking in the old blue dress and the shadows under her own eyes. "There is tea on the sideboard," he said, gesturing with his chin toward a silver tray in the corner. "And toast. It's burnt, but the butter is fresh." Bella walked to the sideboard. She poured a cup of tea. Her hands were perfectly steady. She took a piece of the burnt toast, walked to the heavy leather chair opposite his desk, and sat down. "What happened this morning?" she asked. Her voice was calm, grounded. Desmond leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "Alonzo sent a magistrate here at dawn. He attempted to have me arrested for kidnapping." Bella stopped chewing. The dry toast suddenly felt like ash in her mouth. And I showed the magistrate our marriage registry, signed by his own cousin. Desmond replied, a dark, humorless smile touching the corner of his mouth. I also showed him the promissory notes proving I owned the roof over Alonso's head. The magistrate apologized for the intrusion, drank a cup of my coffee, and rode back to Westford to inform the Duke that he is officially out of options. Bella let out a long, slow breath. She looked down at the dark tea in her cup. My father? I sent a messenger to your family's estate an hour ago, Desmond said. He picked up a thick piece of parchment from the top of the pile and slid it across the desk toward her. The lien against the Smith lands has been formally assumed by the Ashbourne estate and immediately nullified. Your father's debt is erased. His home is secure. Bella stared at the document. It was stamped with red wax. It was exactly what he had promised. No tricks, no hidden clauses. He had ruined Alonso, and he had set her family free. You kept your word, she said softly. I always keep my word, Bella. It is the only currency I have left that holds any value. Desmond picked up his coffee cup. The county will be a hornet's nest by noon. Society will brand you a traitor and a whore. They will call me a pirate. You will likely be entirely cut off from polite society. Bella looked up from the parchment. She looked at the dusty books, the cold fireplace, and the dangerous, exhausted man sitting across from her. Polite society had demanded she marry a drunken leecher to pay for her father's failures. Polite society had expected her to smile while her dignity was stripped away in front of 200 people. Good, Bella said. She took a bite of the burnt toast. It tasted wonderful. I never liked their champagne anyway. Desmond paused, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. A genuine, startled laugh broke from his chest. It was a rich, warm sound that entirely transformed his sharp features. He looked at her not as a weapon and not as a scandal, but as a true equal. We are going to be a terrible problem for this county, Mrs. Hayes, Desmond murmured, his pale eyes gleaming with a newfound respect. I certainly hope so, Lord Ashbourne, Bella replied. She didn't know if they would ever fall in love. She didn't know if this crumbling stone house would ever feel like a home. But as she sat in the dusty library, listening to the morning birds finally begin to sing outside the window, Bella knew one thing for absolute certain. For the first time in her life, she was holding the pen, and she was writing her own ending. Enjoyed the story? If Bella's midnight rebellion and Desmond's ruthless revenge kept you hooked, hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow. What would you have done in Bella's shoes? Endure the humiliation or risk it all with the dangerous rival? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading your reactions. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another dramatic, grounded, historical romance. Share this video with a friend who loves a good scandal, and I'll see you in the next story.